Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecture led about presupposition. A presupposition is a property of propositions by which the truth and felicity depends on the truth of a second proposition. I'll give you an example. If I say my dog is sick, that sentence is only true if I have a dog. If I don't have a dog, this cannot be true. Now, we can go further and say, if I don't have a dog, this sentence cannot even be false. That is to say, we cannot even compute its truth conditions. And we can tell that it's not false because if it were false, then its contradiction would be true. Remember, contradiction is where two propositions cannot be true and false together. If one is true, the other has to be false, and vice versa. So if this is true, its contradiction is false. What's its contradiction? Well, my dog is not sick. So if my dog is sick, then it's false that my dog is not sick. If my dog is not sick, then it's false that my dog is sick. However, in this case, this sentence is not true. And if it's not true, it's false. It's either true or it's false. Well, if it's false, then my dog is not sick is true. But that's not true, right? If I don't have a dog, then my dog is not sick is also not true. It's not false, but it isn't true. So what is it? Well, we say that this is a case of presupposition failure, where the proposition that this depends on is not true. And in that case, we cannot actually compute whether the proposition has meaning. We can't tell if my dog is sick or not, because there's nothing to tell. So we give it no truth value at all. It is uninterpretable. And then the question of presupposition failure has a longer history that isn't quite so simple. And that you can go in, it'll be in the readings, that the notion that you could have propositions that are neither true or false doesn't sit well with some philosophers. And but we'll hold it as true because we're not too worried about whether every proposition has to have a meaning or not. We're also more concerned with the way that this proposition gets built. And so we want to find out where its presupposition comes from. And presuppositions come from what are called presuppositional triggers. So in this case, it would be the word my, which presupposes that I have a dog. And there are a lot of presuppositional triggers. The reading will have a long list of them. But the classic ones are things like definite descriptions or factive verbs like regret. So if I say, I regret taking my dog to the vet, then that asserts that I have regrets, but it presupposes that I took my dog to the vet. Why? Because if I didn't take my dog to the vet, I can't regret it. Right? You can't regret something that isn't true. Now you can regret not doing something. So if I say I didn't take my dog, I regret not taking my dog to the vet, then that presupposes that I didn't take my dog to the vet. And that I can regret. And both of those sentences, by the way, still presuppose that I have a dog. So presupposition triggers are, replete with issues about where the presupposition comes from. Is it just something that comes out of their meaning? Or is it something that we need to write into the meaning? And that's something we'll get into. But presuppositions are really useful in that sense, because a presupposition's truth, a proposition's truth, when it contains a presupposition trigger, allows us to link that truth to other propositions, and sometimes we can even sneak those propositions in. So, for instance, if you didn't know I have a dog, and I say, my dog is sick, now a priori that should be infelicitous, because the felicity of a proposition with a presupposition depends on you knowing this other one. So this is only true if this is true, but this is only felicitous if you know this is true. Now, in that sense, if I say my dog is sick and you don't know I have a dog, then you might stop me. Say, wait, oh, I didn't know you have a dog. Or if I say, my sister got into med school. Oh, I didn't know you had a sister. And so forth. Now, we can stop the conversation, but sometimes, we let it slide. Oftentimes, we let these presuppositions slide. So if I say, my dog is sick, and you didn't know I have a dog, then you might just say, oh, I'm sorry. And in that case, you're accommodating the presupposition. You didn't know it, but you're not going to contest it. And so, you just let it slide. You add it to the things that you know. So you can come to know that I have a dog because of a presupposition. And in that sense, they can be really useful. And we sneak in these presuppositions all the time. Now, sometimes we do it with a more nefarious purpose. We abuse presuppositions to be manipulative. So, a classic example is the leading question in a courtroom. So, if a lawyer asks, a defendant, when did you stop beating your wife? The judge is going to stop him because the question presupposes something, and it presupposes something rather important. So the word stop is a presupposition trigger, and it presupposes that what its complement is has been happening already. So if you ask, when did you stop beating your wife? It presupposes that you've been beating your wife. And so if you answer the question directly, then you accept you accept its presupposition. And so by doing so, you admit, without saying anything, you admit that you beat your wife. So you have to answer the question by attacking its presupposition. Saying, oh, wait, I don't beat my wife. I've never beaten my wife, and so forth. But, when you're on the witness stand, you get nervous, and people get, flustered and tricked, and so the judge will stop the lawyer from asking that kind of question. Politicians do this all the time, too. And they talk about things, and you'll catch them. If you listen for presuppositions, you catch them all the time. And they do that because they want to sneak in points without having to say it. Not only because they can push people in towards their side without really saying things, but it gives them a bit of deniability. Because then when people contest it, say, hey, you said this and that, they say, oh, no, I never said that. Right? And it's true, they never uttered the words, but they did utter something that presupposes those words, and so they made the point without making the point. Okay? So, presuppositions, extremely useful, we use them all the time, and for our purposes, in semantics, what are we going to do with them, right? Well, we can think about them in several ways. One thing that we want to do is try to figure out when we have a presupposition that it's not an entailment. Now, presuppositions and entailments are similar in the sense that, right, if this is true, this has to be true, which sounds like an entailment, right? Right? We say, well, if P is true, then Q is true. Right? And that's the entailment relation. But what we want is the presupposition, and it's slightly different, where P presupposes Q only if Q. Only if Q. So, and this can be seen when we look at the failure of presuppositions. Right? Remember that, or if you don't remember, check out the lecture on it. But when we say if P then Q, this tells us about when P holds, but not about when it doesn't. All right? And we saw that with entailments. If I say my dog has worms, that entails my dog is sick. If P, then Q. But what if P is false? My dog doesn't have worms. Well, then the entailment goes away. Right? This could be true, it could be not true. Maybe it's sick, maybe my dog's not. the entailment doesn't hold, right? So the facts will come into play. And that's how if works. It tells us about when P holds, but not when it doesn't. Contrast that here, P only if Q. This tells us what happens when Q doesn't hold. This won't be true. Right? So if I don't have a dog, this can't be true. And then it doesn't tell us about when Q is true, though. So if Q is true, P could be true, but it could still be false. So this can't be true if I don't have a dog, but it can be true if I do have a dog. But it could still be false, right? Maybe my dog's not sick. Right? So we have a distinction there between entailments and presuppositions. Another one is that negation will flip or cancel out an entailment. But it doesn't necessarily do so with presuppositions. So, for instance, if I say my dog doesn't have worms, then the entailment goes away. Yeah, it's not sick. And in fact, we get a downward entailment. So if I said my dog isn't sick, then it entails that my dog doesn't have worms. Whereas with presuppositions, if I say my dog isn't sick, I still presuppose that I have a dog. Now it gets a little tricky when you put the presupposition trigger under negation. So there's a structural fact that has to be watched out for. So if I say, I didn't see your dog, then you get a sense that presupposes that I have a dog, right? But if I say, I didn't see the King of France yesterday, that sounds true, even though there's no King of France. Right? And so if there's no King of France, then I didn't see, whoever that was. But it still sounds true. So in that sense, it might have to do more with felicity, right? It's easier for me to accept that I have a dog or not. So if I say, I didn't see your dog, and you don't have a dog, then you're like, wait, what do you, I don't have a dog. That is a presupposition you can test. And if I say I didn't see the King of France because there is no King of France, well then that seems perfectly true. So in that sense, does the presupposition survive? And that's the kind of question that has really bugged philosophers and semanticists for a number of years. And so right, it'd be something you can try to figure out. But it's an interesting question, and generally, though, negation will distinguish between entailments and presuppositions. Negations really get rid of entailments, and they sometimes mess with presuppositions, but oftentimes they don't. So there's two ways that we can determine whether entailments whether a relationship between propositions is entailment or presupposition. And so generally, though, presuppositions are going to be extremely useful, and we will use them quite regularly. And in speech we use them quite regularly, and in semantics they really help us, link propositions and link propositions to the state of knowledge of the people around. And the associated reading will go into a bit more detail about the types of presuppositions and their triggers. And once you get a handle on how these things work, then you'll be able to apply them in lots of useful situations.